The Defense Department, of which I was a part, had been wrestling with writing a new defense policy for 2 years, the whole of my tenure as the vice chief. In the end, as the sort of general manager of the firm, which is what the vice chief is, I did the sums and came to the conclusion that that which was being promised as deliverable from this policy in way of capability didn't match the money that was going to be spent, and particularly the way it was being spent, particularly the money that was going to be spent in the capital account. I said it won't fly. My advice wasn't listened to. The policy went forward to government from the department anyway, and I said no and resigned on it.
Admiral Thomas may have been the highest-ranking officer to resign over ill-advised spending, but he wasn't the first. 20 years earlier, Captain Nick Stetham had sacrificed his career to make the same point.
Defense policy had become a fraud, and I found it extremely difficult to tell my troops that tomorrow it was going to get better, and being in Germany, to tell my troops that should anything happen, we would be able to do the job, when I knew for a fact that we couldn't do the job and that tomorrow things were not at all likely to get better.
When I resigned as the Vice Chief of Defense Staff because I didn't think that the advice that was being put forward to government was valid or affordable, it was, you know, for Canada, a fairly public action. I was never, ever called before the Parliamentary Committee on Defense to explain myself. Never. It surprised me. In fact, Front Page Challenge took more interest in why I'd resigned than did the Parliamentary Committee.
All right, panel, we're leading off with a national story.
Last April, the federal government's proposals to cut defense spending got a stormy reaction from Vice Admiral Charles Thomas. The deputy commander of the armed forces charged that Canada's antiquated weapons systems not only placed the lives of military personnel in danger, but were inadequate to defend Canadian sovereignty. In a stunning gesture of protest, our guest resigned his post. Welcome, Vice Admiral Charles Thomas.
Vice Admiral, were you ashamed of the outmoded tubs we sent off to the Gulf War?
We were very lucky it didn't get worse than it did. New ships were coming down the line, but they're not here yet. And we were right on the margins. I don't think that's a right thing to do to your sons and daughters and mine 5 or 10 or 15 years in the future in an uncertain world. If we're going to have an armed force, we better equip it. If we don't think we need an armed force, then we don't have to. But so long as we do, we better buy them the tools for their job. And we haven't been doing that for 20 years.
That's right, it's hypocrisy. Now
I'm not sure that any of the parties in Parliament wanted to open up the defense debate to an intense public scrutiny because it's damn awkward for them.
Governments have been warned repeatedly since the mid-'80s that if they did not properly fund the armed forces for the commitments the government has undertaken, then they would eventually end up in a position from the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s of having no armed forces or very little capabilities in the armed forces. A difficult state where one Chief of Defense Staff, John Boyle, announced that the Canadian forces had no warfighting capabilities whatsoever. No one in government can argue that they haven't been told this, because they have been told it by chiefs of defense, deputy ministers, people outside the armed forces, people inside the armed forces, and so on. So the government knows the consequences of its decisions not to fund the armed forces. So in that sense, it is a deliberate policy of the government to disarm the armed forces, or to allow them to wither away to a state where they cannot be used.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the end of the 45-year nuclear standoff between the USSR and the United States of America. But with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the surfacing of other civil and ethnic encounters around the world, the expected peace dividend never came. Despite increased international demands for Canadian troops, financial cutbacks continued to limit the capability of Canadian forces.
There was a substantial change in the military starting at the end of the Cold War. Well, once there was no real requirement anymore for us to maintain heavy combat forces, the government of the day found it very economical to start losing these kinds of capabilities. We really see no reason for it.
The irony is, Canada is more engaged globally today than it was during the Cold War in terms of the range of activities we are involved in.
The world changed, and the soldiers knew it. The bureaucracy didn't catch on, and the bureaucracy didn't catch up, and the bureaucracy did not support those soldiers.
The gap we had at the end of the Cold War was we had too many commitments, not enough forces. We continue to do that, make commitments abroad for which we may lack adequate resources.
There developed what came to be known as the commitment capability gap, where on the one hand we said that we were going to be able to do a number of things, but in reality we did not have the capabilities, we did not have the number of people, we did not have the appropriate amount of weapons, we didn't have the long tail of logistics and so on that would be capable of actually doing that.
We tried to have it both ways. We decided that we would keep our place at the high table of NATO while steadily reducing the armed forces on the argument that really there wasn't going to be another war.
One of the greatest embarrassments to me as a serving officer was to hear the Canadian military, the commander of Mobile Command, promising a contingency plan which would look at putting 12,000 Canadian soldiers in the Gulf, when we had nowhere that capability, nowhere near it, and we would have been threatening Canadian lives if we'd even attempted to put that sort of a force in the Gulf without months of training, re-equipping, etc.
After 41 days of Desert Storm, Canadian CF-18 fighter jets were allowed to join American-led Allied forces in Desert Sabre, a final two-day bombing of Iraqi troops. On February 28, 1991, Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein agreed to a ceasefire. Over 80,000 Iraqi prisoners of war were taken, 40 out of 42 Iraqi divisions destroyed. The Canadian naval blockade had intercepted 7,882 ships, boarded 996, and diverted 46 trying to break United Nations sanctions. Devastating pictures of property and oil reserve fires were broadcast around the world.
The political aim, so far as I could understand it, of sending our forces to the Gulf was to show Canadians that we were out there and willing to participate with our allies, but to avoid Canadians having to see our troops being injured or our troops doing any killing. In other words, it was all upside. Not only did we go to war in the Gulf and participate with everybody else, at least according to the word from Ottawa, but at the same time, there weren't going to be any body bags coming home, we weren't going to lose any equipment, and there wouldn't be any pictures of Canadians killing anybody. Just perfect, an absolutely perfect military operation from the government's point of view. Now, mind you, for our allies, it was a totally transparent fraud.